So the promise is both before the law in time and in priority.
Today I have a guest with me, Dr. John Whittaker, who is going to help us go through a text and just kind of give us some good feedback on some of the stuff that we've been talking about on the channel lately. As you know, I've been addressing Hebrew roots issues, Torah observance, and John's going to be helping us with some of that. His background, a little bit of what I know, is that he has been a professor at Boise Bible College, pastor multiple places. I don't know everything. But yeah, just to get started, just tell us a little about yourself, your background, stuff you're working on right now.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
I taught at Boise Bible College for 19 years. I got my undergrad degree from Boise Bible College, moved to Ohio, did graduate school in Ohio. Did my doctorate at Gordon Conwell out of Boston, and did that while I was teaching at the college. So I taught there for about 19 years, taught New Testament, theology, a little intro to philosophy, taught a lot of courses on how to study the Bible, and taught preaching and preachers. So just a wide variety of things there at the college. And as well, I preached at New Beginnings Christian Church at Kuna, helped start that church, and preached there for a long time, and most recently was preaching at the Pursuit here in town, and did that, transitioned out of that. Now I'm currently doing this kind of stuff, where creating some video courses, got a podcast where really my heart and soul behind it is just to help people learn the Bible, live the Bible, and so I want to try to provide some online resources that people can have in their hands on demand to actually learn and live the Bible.
Yeah. So. What's caused you to be interested in that particular pursuit of, just wanting to help people learn the Bible?
Yeah, well, obviously, generally help people learn the Bible because I believe this is the foundation for really our Christian life, and it provides a parameter for that. But in this medium, online resources and some of that's really grown out of my experience with particularly the younger generation who didn't grow up going to church and isn't familiar with the Bible. They don't know basic Bible stories, and sometimes they show up in church because they know there's got to be more to life, and they feel like the preacher's just flipping open this book and talking through it. They don't know where they're at. They don't know if it's before Jesus, after Jesus. They know nothing about it, and just that confusion. And then people's lives are so busy and so crazy, it's just increasingly difficult to get people to go to another church event. I mean, they go to church on Sunday, maybe a small group Bible study during the week, and that's it. And nothing that systematically helps them get the framework for the Bible or the understanding of the Bible. And so man, could we provide some resources that churches could use, that people could have in their hands, that could help them figure out what's this Bible all about, how do you study it, how do you live it out. So that's kind of the heart behind what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, I know for me what drew me to kind of get an idea of what the whole Bible's about was doing apologetics. I come across this or that argument against the Bible or against a particular belief, and it has made me say, well, why do I think what I think, or are they right, or whatever that is. And it's definitely caused me to say, well, why did Paul say this? Why does he quote? What's he quoting from? And it's helped me to do that. But not everybody's an apologetics nerd like me. So it's good to have that. I think because really we all should be all Christians should be at some level a theologian. You should have an understanding of the big picture of how this book fits into the whole grand scheme of things, and that kind of stuff.
And just so many people just don't. People just don't. So
that's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So as you know, I've been encountering and dealing with a lot of stuff related to Hebrew roots, Torah observance. There's a lot of folks out there that say Christians today are supposed to keep the law of Moses, and what that typically means is they say. Most of them say, we're saved by grace through faith alone. They don't believe it's a works righteousness thing, but they do believe that in order to be obedient to God, it's the law. It's going back to that. And, what that ends up looking like is, we keep the Sabbath. We should be doing the feast days. We should be doing the dietary laws. We should, not celebrate Christmas or Easter or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
But, obviously, there's different views on sacrifices, whether that's something that's
Should be reinstituted.
should be that's going to be legitimately reinstituted someday, and that's what we should be doing. There's a lot of there's a lot of variance among people, but the reason I wanted to get together with you is I know, like you said, going verse by verse, going exegetical through the text is just something that not a lot of people do, and I wanted to get your expertise on the scriptures and on kind of that stuff. What is your background and experience with folks that have been doing that are from that perspective?
Yeah, not tons, to be honest. I did have a student in one of my hermeneutics classes, Bible study skills courses, that was part of a congregation, even though he wasn't a Jew by heritage, he was a Gentile by heritage, right? But part of a congregation where they were reading the text in Hebrew. They were big into the Hebrew laws, and so of that background, I've had contact with some Messianic Jews who were fairly strong on feeling like that everyone really should keep those the laws and all that. But so not tons, but at least I've had some interaction. I'm a little familiar with it, but not like the details. Probably to your degree, not nearly as much. So
okay. Well, that's cool. And I think that's good because, honestly, it's when it comes to the Bible, it's the Bible. And if you really understand the whole of Scripture and you understand how everything fits together, that's how you can really address a lot of those things that come up. Once you understand what the question is, you can say, well, no, here's why we believe what we believe. And I think that's important.
This particular topic, there's a boatload written in the New Testament on this topic.
Right.
Because it was a pressing issue for the first church.
Yeah.
And it was an issue that dogged the Apostle Paul's ministry. Most of the conflict he had sadly came from fellow Jews, some of whom were believers, who were pushing this very issue. It was like, you're a renegade, you're doing your own thing, you're being unfaithful to, God's word and God's promises because you're telling Gentiles they don't have to keep the Old Testament law. And that created a lot of hard conversations and conflict for the Apostle Paul. So there's a boatload on this topic, scattered in various places throughout the New Testament. In some places, like the text we're going to look at, the book of Galatians, the whole book is on this particular topic in a large way.
So one question that I had related to that is, what would you say, fundamentally, I know you don't have a lot of background in the specifics, but when someone says we should be keeping the Old Testament law as Christians today, whether Jew or Gentile, what would you say is the main misunderstanding that's causing them to come to that conclusion?
Yeah, and I would say it's a failure to recognize the idea of covenant. Okay. That the Old Testament law is not a standalone sort of thing. It's part of a covenant, and it's specifically part of God's covenant with Israel. And so even the Ten Commandments, as foundational and fundamental as those seem to be to us, even the Ten Commandments are set within the context of God's work with and plan for and redemption of Israel. So you read Exodus chapter 20 and you read the Ten Commandments, and the narrative context of that is God redeeming Israel and establishing them as his people. And so the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law, is part of an old covenant that was a covenant with Israel, for Israel. That covenant reached its fulfillment and its climax in Jesus, and that ushered in a new covenant that is different than that old covenant and other than that old covenant. So to me, that's the fundamental problem, is the issue of covenant. That actually shows up here in this passage I want to look at here in a little bit, is that idea of covenant and what the covenant is all about.
Right. So the issue being Old Covenant, New Covenant, and
the law being part of that old covenant. So,
would you, and one question I have before we get into the text just occurred to me is, one of the things that they say a lot, and you may not have heard this, but a lot of folks who are promoting this will say of Christians, of people in the churches and stuff like that are not part of their movement, that because they're not following that Old Testament law, that they're promoting lawlessness, that they're promoting, not obeying God. I mean, can you speak a little bit to that? What is...
That's great, because that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is dealing with.
Yeah.
Where are the people of God found? Where do you experience the full blessing of Abraham and God's kingdom? Do you experience it in Torah, or do you experience it in Messiah? And the point of Galatians is no longer Torah, now Messiah, right? And so Paul gets that very same criticism in Galatians as well as in Romans and in other places. You see Paul interacting with that. In Galatians, it shows it particularly. So in the writing of the book, the way he responds to that criticism, he responds to it towards the end. Galatians chapter 5, he responds to that very issue of lawlessness. And so he actually addresses that. And when he addresses that, he makes this point, that in order to be part of God's kingdom, you still have to be ruled by God. If you're part of God's kingdom, that means God still is king, so you're still under his authority. Right? Okay, well then, if it's not the Torah that is how God rules his people now, how does God rule his people? In Messiah. And Paul says in Galatians 5, he rules his people by the Spirit. And so he says, Galatians 5:16, if you walk by the Spirit, you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. And so the flesh is the anti-God, against God's rules, way of doing life. Walk by the Spirit, you won't carry out that desire. And then he says this, verse 17, he says that the flesh wars against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. These two are in opposition to one another, so that you can't do whatever you want. So in Messiah, it's not like, there's no Torah, so we can live however we want. No, you can't do that because God's Spirit is going to rule you and lead you away from the flesh. Well, then he lists off the deeds of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. Very familiar, right? Fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. But the part that gets overlooked is this. At the end of that, it says, against such things, there is no law. Why does he bring that up? Because in the context of the whole book, and in Galatians 5 in particular, what he's arguing is the law, i.e. the Torah, the Mosaic Law, will never condemn you for being a person full of love, for being a person full of joy and peace and patience and kindness. The law will never do that. In fact, what the law will actually do is stand there and applaud like, that's the kind of person I always dreamed of making, but I wasn't capable because the raw material the law had to work with was bad. It was the flesh. And now, by virtue of the Spirit, God can actually make us the kind of people he's always wanted to, but under Torah he wasn't, but in Messiah by the Spirit he can.
Wow, cool. Well, let's get into it.
That's probably way more than you wanted, but it's
really
that's important stuff.
That's awesome. No, I really appreciate that. That's kind of like, where I was looking at, because we still have to be obedient. Paul says over and over again as he's talking about grace in various books. It's not just Galatians. Shall we then sin that grace may abound? That kind of stuff. And he says, may it never be, may it never be. Most of those are like, shall we, am I advocating sin? No, there's still a standard. There's still, and that, the fruit of the Spirit is a good way of expressing that. It's like we live by these fruits of the Spirit. We should be, having these in our life, and if we do, we're being in conformity with the law.
Well, and even that text you just alluded to, Romans 6. Again, context is the background is still the same issue that he knows he's having to address. Is people who are saying, well, if you're going to throw out the Torah as the means by which God governs his people, then it's going to lead to fleshly living. So you get in verse 16 the whole issue. Well, no, sin's not going to be master over you, he says, because you're not under the law. Well, what in the world is he getting at? Well, you keep reading and you get to chapter 7, you realize Paul believes that the law actually unwittingly was an unwitting accomplice with sin and with the flesh, because the law could not change the raw material it was working with. They needed something more. And then you get to chapter 8 with, therefore, by the Spirit. The Spirit, if you walk by the Spirit, and all that. And when you walk by the Spirit, Romans 8, you actually fulfill the righteous requirement of the law by the Spirit. So what the law is trying to create is not actually achieved by the law; it's achieved by the Spirit.
Cool.
So a lot of theology in there, but it's really important stuff.
That's great. That's why I hear. So let's get into it with Galatians and what you can share.
Galatians chapter 3. If I just want to walk down and hit some highlights. There's a lot here, but let me just give you a little backstory to the book of Galatians in total to make sure we understand this. The churches of Galatia are churches that were located in what is now modern-day Turkey, right in the center of modern-day Turkey. Paul had started these churches on his first missionary journey, and more than likely, this is written probably after Acts 15, although scholars do debate exactly when it was written, so we don't know that for sure. But we know who it was written to, and we know what the issue is, that there has been some Jewish believers who have come to these predominantly Gentile churches and have essentially told them this very same thing. Unless you keep the law of Moses, you're not really faithfully following God or following Jesus, and you really can't experience the blessing of Abraham from Genesis chapter 12. That's the backstory behind this. And so whenever you read a New Testament letter, there's always a backstory. You're listening to one end of the conversation, and you need to know what's going on the other side. Well, that's what's going on the other side. So these churches now are being kind of plagued by this question. Well, do we have to keep the law of Moses in order to genuinely be saved, and in order to really be a Christian, in order to be part of Abraham's blessing in the kingdom of God? And I just want to look at Galatians chapter 3, because in Galatians 3, Paul really takes that up full force. The first couple chapters are more argument from his personal experience. Chapter 3 is kind of the beginning of the theological argument.
Okay.
And I want to pick up around verse 7. Paul has just basically said, how did you experience the Spirit to the Galatian churches? When you first experienced the Spirit, was it by keeping the Torah or not? The answer is not, right?
Right.
And so then he jumps in verse 7 and says, all right, now let's look at it from a biblical perspective. And because he's dealing with a Jewish issue and an Old Testament law issue, he jumps back to the Old Testament law and says, let's make sure we understand this properly. And so he's going to start with Abraham. And what he's going to argue in Galatians 3 is really a chronological argument about Abraham, the law, Messiah, and us. Okay? And so he picks up with Abraham, and let me just read to you what he says, beginning in verse 7 through 9. He says this: "Know then that it's those who are of faith who are the children of Abraham." For Paul, being a child of Abraham has more to do with faith than even with race and blood and all that.
Right.
It's faith. In the context so far of the letter, we know that the faith is going to stand somewhat in contrast with Torah, with law. Okay, let's keep going. Know that as those who are of faith are the sons of Abraham, children of Abraham, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles, non-Jews, by faith, preached the gospel to them beforehand to Abraham, saying this, and he quotes what God said to Abraham way back in Genesis chapter 12, "In you all the nations shall be blessed." Real quick little technical note that's very important in that verse. He says that God would bless the Gentiles, or justify the Gentiles by faith. And then he quotes Genesis 12:3, "In you all the nations shall be blessed." Just know that in both Greek and Hebrew, the word translated Gentile and the word translated nation is the same word.
Right.
Ta ethne in Greek, right? Goyim in Hebrew. So it's the same word. And this is terribly important to realize it's the same word, because what that means is nations, i.e. Gentiles, are blessed in Abraham. And they're blessed in Abraham how? By faith.
Right.
By faith. So then he ends by saying, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. It was Abraham's faith by which Abraham received the blessing. Gentiles, nations, us, we're going to be blessed by faith. Now, from there then, he says, okay, well, what about the law? And now Paul says some pretty negative things about the law. This is important to hear, even though it's going to sound really, really harsh, but it's the Apostle Paul, so I think we should take him seriously. He says this: "For," explaining this, that the nations, the Gentiles, are blessed by their faith, not anything else. He says, "For, because all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse." So if you, works of the law equals works of Torah. If you rely, depend on that for your justification, you're under a curse. That's actually not a controversial point in Paul's day.
Right.
Almost all Jews in Paul's day would agree. They would nod their head in agreement. When Paul said that, they would say, well, no, that's true. We went to Babylonian captivity, right? Temple was destroyed. Temple's been rebuilt, but God's Shekinah glory has never refilled the temple. We're still waiting for the full end of exile to come. So most Jews in Paul's day, when he says that, they would nod their head in agreement.
Yeah.
The law brought a curse. Okay? Paul keeps going. He says, "For it's written," quotes Deuteronomy, "Cursed be everyone who doesn't abide by all the things written in the book of the law to do them." The law really is a doing them system, and it's an all or nothing thing because it's a covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of Deuteronomy 28, the Mount Evil curses and all that. If you keep this covenant, God says to Moses, and Moses says to the people, if you keep this covenant, here's the blessings of keeping it. If you don't keep this covenant, here's the curses of breaking it. The ultimate curse is going into exile. We know the Old Testament story. That's what happened. That's why most Jews wouldn't disagree with Paul. Right? Mm-hmm. So then he says this. He says, this translation says, now it's evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. It's a possible translation. I actually think it's better to translate that a little bit differently. This is a little technical point, not hugely critical for our point today, but I think Paul's already felt like he's proved the point that the law brings a curse. Right? He's already said that. The Old Testament law agrees with that. Most Jews would agree with that. He doesn't feel the need to prove that. So I think what he says here, now, because it's evident that no one is justified before God by the law, which is the point he just made, then the righteous shall live by faith. In other words, what he's saying is, since we know the law brought the curse, how do we live? And he quotes Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 11, which is in the context, again, of the Babylonian captivity, saying, well, since we know the law brought the curse, we live by faith. Righteous people live by faith. The justified people live by faith. Again, same point he made with Abraham. What's the line of demarcation for the people of God? Is it Torah or is it faith? And he says it's faith. All right, now, keep going. He says, now the law is not of faith. And you're like, wait a second. Wasn't there faith under the Old Testament? Indeed there was. Paul is using faith, and it becomes very clear when he gets to the end of this chapter. Paul's using faith in a very specific sense. He's using faith in trusting the Messiah. And so he's going to use it in that sense. He's also using faith in this sense to contrast with the law being a doing system. Rather than a trusting system, it's a doing system. So he says this. The law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. So the righteous will live by faith. The law requires you to live by the law.
Okay. Can I ask you a question on that?
Yes.
When it says live by faith, what does that phrase mean?
The
righteous shall live by faith.
That's a quote from Habakkuk 2:11. So looking back, whenever you find an Old Testament quote in the New Testament, it's a good idea to look at it in its Old Testament context. So in the Old Testament context, Habakkuk is complaining to God because God has told him the Babylonians are going to come, and that's going to be how he deals with the disobedience and the unfaithfulness of his people. And Habakkuk then protests, God, the cure is worse than the disease. and God says to Habakkuk, you got to trust me on this. I know what I'm doing. The righteous shall live by faith. So in this context, it's specifically trusting God, even in sending the Babylonians, right? But it becomes sort of, in the New Testament, for the Apostle Paul and the New Testament writers, it becomes sort of this definitive line for how God's people are marked. They're marked by this genuine, faithful, loyal allegiance to Yahweh. That's what that means. And so even when it doesn't make sense, even when God does something crazy like send the Babylonians or anything else, we have loyal, faithful allegiance to Yahweh. When we get to the end of this chapter, Paul's going to say, when the faith came, and he means the faith in Messiah. So how do you experience that loyal, faithful allegiance to Yahweh now?
Through Jesus.
Not just trusting him in the midst of Babylon captivity. Now, God's plan has moved forward. Now it's through trusting Jesus, putting faith in Jesus. So,
cool.
All right. Christ redeemed us, Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the law, becoming a curse for us, for it's written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, again, quoting the Old Testament, and that this idea that to be hanged on a tree, when that was first written in Deuteronomy, meant to have your body hanged out in the open. By Jesus' day, it was applied to being crucified, and so in Paul and Jesus' day, to be crucified meant you were under God's curse. And so that's why it was so difficult for Jews in Paul's day to actually believe in Messiah. Because how could somebody who was cursed by God be God's Messiah? Well, Jesus was obviously cursed by God because he was hung on a cross. And that's the whole stumbling block of the cross and all that. Cursed is everyone who was hanging on a tree. In our context, Jesus took that curse that the law brought because of their unfaithfulness of the covenant, so that, here's Paul's point, so that in Messiah Jesus, the blessing of Abraham might come to both the Gentiles, so that we all, Jews and Gentiles alike, might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith, not through the law. And so the promise of the Spirit and the blessing of Abraham is received by faith, not by Torah, because what the Torah brought was a curse, whereas the blessing of Abraham is received by faith. Faith brought blessing. Faith, promise brought blessing. That's the contrast Paul's working with. Okay? Now, with all of that as a backdrop, Paul is ready then to apply the situation to his audience, which is real similar to some of the stuff you're dealing with. And so let me just summarize a couple things real quick, because it's a chronological argument that he makes. And so the argument he's going to make beginning in verse 15 of chapter 3 is he takes the idea of a person's last will and testament, because the word testament in Greek is the same word for covenant, diatheke in Greek, same word. And so he takes that idea and he says, let me give you a human example. When someone makes a last will and testament and they sign it, they notarize it, it's ratified, it can't be changed. There it is. You can't change it after that person dies. Well, Paul takes that idea of a last will and testament, or a covenant, a diatheke in Greek, it's the same idea, and he says, now the promises to Abraham, the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It doesn't say and to offsprings, but offspring, meaning Messiah. All right, now, Paul's not dumb. He knows that the word sperma in Greek, seed, or the word, the same word in Hebrew is a collective. It could be singular or it's a collective noun. You know, right? You don't say sheeps, you say sheep, and it means one or many. It
could be one or both.
But right. Paul knows that. Right. But he's saying, let me just capitalize on the singular for a second.
Let me just make it clear for you.
Let me capitalize on that, because the initial fulfillment of this promise to Abraham was Isaac.
Right.
And then the initial, that line of promise carries through Jacob. Not Esau, but Jacob. We're having to whittle this down the whole time anyhow, right? Jacob. Then Jacob and his family becomes the nation of Israel. But they were unfaithful to the covenant. They're the fulfillment of the promise initially. They're unfaithful. They suffer the curse. And how is God going to solve that problem? Well, there's going to be an ultimate fulfillment of that seed promise, the offspring promise. And who's that ultimate fulfillment? Paul says that's Messiah. And so what's true of Messiah is true of those in him. He is the ultimate seed of Abraham, the ultimate offspring of Abraham. And so, and to your offspring, who is the Messiah. Here's what I mean, Paul says. And this is the really important part. So get this, all right? Okay. Get this. Here's what I mean. The law, the Torah, which came 430 years after the promise to Abraham, doesn't annul a covenant, a last will and testament, previously ratified by God.
Right. So
the promise is both before the law in time and in priority.
Yeah.
It precedes it in time by 430 years, and it precedes it in priority. The promise doesn't, the law coming in later doesn't nullify the promise made to Abraham. All right? Right? Now, how was the promise received? We've already discussed that earlier. It was received by faith. Right. Did Abraham have to keep the Torah? No.
Didn't have it.
Didn't have to keep it, right? That's Paul's point. The promise was received by faith. It's those who are of faith that are blessed with Abraham. The law brought a curse. The faith brings the promise and the blessing. So you receive the promise by faith. You experience the blessing of Abraham by faith. And just because the law came later doesn't mean it negates that. The promise to Abraham is the key thing.
Yeah.
All right? So he says, for if the inheritance comes by the law, the Torah, it no longer comes by a promise. But God gave it to Abraham on the basis of promise, not by Torah. All right. Then the natural question is, and maybe some of your audience is asking this question, well, then why the law?
Yeah.
Why the law? If the promise is so important, if it was always going to be by the promise, it was always going to be faith in the promise, and that's how the blessing is going to come, and God's going to mark out his people by the promise, then why give the law in the first place?
Yeah.
Good question. Paul asks and answers that. Verse 19. Why the law? The law was added. The Torah was added. Notice that.
Added.
Yeah. It was added. The promise is the key thing. The Torah was added onto the promise at a later date for a specific purpose and for a limited time. That's the point Paul's going to make. So the promise is the priority. So why the law then? Well, it was added because of transgressions. what does it mean because of transgressions? Well, that word because of can mean a couple different things in the Greek, but here most likely what it means is to point out or to enunciate transgressions. Prior to the Torah, there was this sense of sin and missing the mark, but they weren't enunciated. They weren't transgressions yet. Transgressions means you stepped out of bounds. You crossed over a known rule. So the law was added to enunciate transgressions, to turn sin into transgression, so everyone would know what right and wrong was.
Okay,
So,
yeah. I have a question.
Yeah.
It seems like that's similar to like in Romans 5 when he talks about, before the law, people were sinning and dying.
Yep.
And,
It's
even
the
though they had
same
no law,
concept.
where there's no law, there's no sin. But really, it says they were a law to themselves. Like there's something more basic than the Torah in terms of what identifies sin.
Yeah.
But then giving that, as you say, added, it says, okay, and here's a whole bunch of other ones.
Yeah. But not only here's a whole bunch of other ones, but that thing that you have felt was wrong, but you couldn't articulate why, now you know why. And now you know what it is. It gave it a name. So what the law did was it gave sin a face and a name. Mm-hmm. And now it's transgression.
Yeah. Okay.
And you get the same thing, Romans 5:21 and following there, what you're looking at, where sin was in the world before Moses, but it was vague and it was abstract, and now became transgression once the law of Moses came. And so the law was given for a specific purpose. Purpose was to enunciate transgressions, but it was also given for a limited time. And we have to get this. This is where the problem is with this idea. Notice what he says. It was added because of transgressions until. There is a deadline. There is an end point to the law, because the law is part of a covenant and it had a specific job. That's not me saying the until. That's the Apostle Paul saying the law. The promise was here. The law was tacked on for a time being until. What's the until? Until the offspring should come to whom the promise had been made. And he's already enunciated who that offspring, that specific seed is. That's the Messiah. Until the offspring, the specific seed, the ultimate fulfillment of the promise should come. And the law was put in place through angels by an intermediary. Now the intermediary implies more than one, but God is one. So, main point there is the law was given for a specific job, to turn sin into transgression, and was given for a limited time until Messiah should come, the offspring should come. At that point, when that should happen, the law's job was done. Its day was over. It was added for a purpose and for a time. All right? And then he goes on and says this, well, then is the law contrary to the promises of God? Is it a bad thing? Was it making it sound, because Paul's like, well, hold on. Let me not prove too much, right? Like, I don't want to make it sound like the Torah is a bad thing.
Right.
It's just a temporary thing. Temporary doesn't mean bad.
Right.
Temporary just means temporary. It doesn't mean a bad thing. And Paul never says the law is a bad thing. I mean, Romans 7. Is the law bad? Is the law sin? No. The law is holy and righteous and good. It's not a bad thing. It's just a short-term temporary thing for a specific time, for a specific purpose.
Yeah.
Right? So, is the law contrary to the promises of God? Certainly not. And here's the problem with the law. For if a law had been given that could give life, then righteousness would indeed have been by the law. If the Torah was actually capable of imparting the eternal kind of life, then guess what? We would have needed something else. But that wasn't its job, and it wasn't capable of doing that. But the Scripture, instead of the law doing that, because it couldn't, here's what the law did. The Scripture imprisoned everything under sin so that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to all those who believe. So the law had a temporary job to do. It's not contrary to the promises of God. It just was never designed to, never intended to be the final solution to human sin. What it did was take sin, turn it into transgression, so that now we're all imprisoned to that sin so that we could find freedom in Messiah by faith. So that's, now with that then he makes the final point. Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned again until the coming faith would be revealed. The specific faith in Jesus, the Messiah that he's talked about. So before faith came, and he means faith in Messiah, this specific kind of faith. So then, and he gives another analogy, so then the law was this translation, guardian. Some translations, schoolmaster. I think the NIV says tutor. The Greek word is pedagogue. And it was
just like a teacher.
Yeah, it was a well-known custom in the ancient world. A wealthy landowner would have slaves as part of their world. One of his more trusted slaves, he would actually entrust with the care of his children. And his job was to actually escort the child to school and back, to escort him to various places in town, help him with his homework. And his job would be to actually, he had a lot of responsibility, sort of like a live-in nanny, had a lot of responsibility for raising that child, right? That's what this is, this word guardian refers to, is that function. A slave who fulfilled the function really as a caretaker and tutor and kind of live-in nanny for their child. So, the law was that, our pedagogue, our guardian, our live-in nanny, until Messiah came. Until Messiah came. It had a job. Its job was short-term. It was a good job and an important job, very important job. But it was a temporary job until Messiah should come. In order that we might be justified by faith. Not justified by Torah. God's people. Justified means declared right, put in right standing with God. So it's saying where's the boundary marker for the people of God? Where are the righteous people, those that belong to God and are part of God's people, found? Where are they found? They're found in Messiah by faith, not in Torah by doing it. That's the argument of this. And that was always God's design. So now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian. The guardian means what? The law.
The law, right.
We're no longer under it now that the faith has come in Jesus. So we're no longer under the tutor. Why? Because we've reached that stage where, just like in the analogy, the kid would eventually get to a point where he was old enough that he didn't need the tutor anymore, and the dad would say, okay, your job is done. Well, the law, we got to the point in the fullness of time, when Messiah came, we've reached the age of maturity, the law's day is over, its job is done, and we're done with that. So now we're all sons of God through faith. And that's kind of where the argument is, that we're all God's children, God's sons. We've experienced the blessing of Abraham by faith in Messiah, because Messiah is the ultimate fulfillment of the promise to Abraham.
Okay, right on. Yeah,
that's a lot. There's a boatload in there. That's an
sure.
overview real quick. But I think the key thing is the chronology, to not miss the chronology. Promise to Abraham, priority in time as well as in purpose. Lot tacked on for an important purpose, but a short-term purpose. When Messiah came, the law's job was done. The day is over. Now God's people are defined in Messiah.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. I was going to ask you a comment on, like, if it's all based on a promise, and that's the sort of the bedrock of everything, and the law gets added for a time, it seems to go along with the principle, the son is not greater than his father. Moses is a descendant of Abraham,
right?
Who's by definition greater? Abraham, right? And what Paul is saying is that the promise, that the covenant with Abraham is a more foundational covenant than the covenant with Moses.
Right.
That it's and that is a covenant of the righteous will live by faith. It's by faith that we are partakers of that promise, and that's really what he's getting at. It seems like that's the more foundational thing.
It is. I think in order to be fair to Paul, we wouldn't want to use the word covenant for what happens with Abraham, because that's just Paul refers to it as just the promise.
Promise, right.
So the Mosaic Covenant and the promise to Abraham.
Okay, so I've heard covenant, people will say like unconditional covenant.
Yeah.
It's a covenant God's making with Abraham, but there's no terms for Abraham.
Yeah.
It's just like,
this is a one-sided.
It's a one-sided sort of thing.
It's a one-sided sort of thing. I promise to do this for you. Whereas under the Mosaic Covenant, it was
here's the terms.
Here's the terms, and if you don't, if you don't keep it, here's the curses. If you do, here's the blessings, and that you get that very much in Deuteronomy and all that. Yeah. One of the other things that's important too is, and Paul argues this in Romans chapter 4, is, and I think it's hinted at here with the quote from Habakkuk 2:11, is that there's certainly faith in the Old Testament, and faith is priority, and so righteous people have always lived by faith. That's what pointed it out. Abraham is righteous, declared him righteous was his faith. And that's really what God is looking for, not so much that you keep all the niggly details of the Mosaic Covenant. So even under the Old Covenant, faith was still the priority. Faith was still the priority. And
Yeah.
now the main thing is okay, so we've got the Mosaic Covenant and we've got the Messiah Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Which covenant is the ultimate covenant? And what Paul is arguing here and elsewhere in his letters is the Mosaic Covenant's day is done.
Mm-hmm.
It's a historical chronological argument. It had a short-term job. Its day is done. Now the covenant is with the Messiah, and anyone who's in the Messiah is treated like he's treated. They're treated as a son of God, a child of God, because of their faith in him. So if you think in terms of two boxes, where do you find God's people today? You don't find them in the Torah box. You find them in the Messiah box.
Right.
Can people in the Messiah box keep some of that Old Covenant stuff if they want to?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see that even in the New Testament. Paul even, where Paul gets incensed is when you insist that people, particularly Gentiles, have to keep that.
Right.
That's what's going on in Galatians. And you can tell Paul's not a happy camper at the beginning of Galatians. I mean, he begins the letter, no thanksgiving, no pronouncement of blessing like in all his other letters. What there is if anyone preaches a gospel other than what I'm preaching to you, let him be accursed. In our language, let him go to hell. Let him be damned. Yeah. It's very strong language. Galatians chapter 5, Paul actually talking about circumcision. He actually feeling very strong feelings, because if you're going to insist Gentiles have to keep the Mosaic law, Paul gets upset. You hear in Galatians 5 when he says, look, if you get circumcised and say you got to be part of the Mosaic covenant, then guess what? The Messiah is of no benefit for you. And then he ends that little paragraph by saying, so if you're so interested in, it's pretty funny actually, if you're so interested in cutting on that thing, why don't you go the whole way and cut it off? Why don't you castrate yourself? Because he knows, okay, fine, by the Torah covenant, a castrated person can't be a full worshiper of God. So he's actually, it's a jab at them, because he's frustrated. He's frustrated because he knows that God's people are now defined by faith in Messiah, not in Torah. So if you want to keep some of that Torah stuff, more power to you. Just don't make anyone else do it, and treat each other with respect. Treat each other with respect if you disagree on that.
Yeah. What would you say? I know a lot of folks will say it's just really all that Galatians is saying, and because he does say this at the beginning, is that you can't be justified or saved through works of the law. You can't even add works to your faith and expect that people have to add in order to be saved.
Right.
But we're not saying that. We're not saying you have to do that to be saved. We're just saying you have to do that to be truly obedient to God. What would you say if someone were to come up to you and say that?
Yeah, obviously, what we just looked at in Galatians 3 is like, well, Paul doesn't say that. Paul says it was a covenant, and as a covenant, its day is done. So I would say that. That's really important. The other thing is be saved is such a modern term. So it's really hard to deal with that biblically speaking. Does be saved mean be justified? Because to be justified in Paul's language meant to mark out the people of God. Can you experience the full blessing of Abraham without keeping this is the question.
That's what it seems to be saying, right?
Could you experience the full blessing of Abraham without keeping the Torah? And Paul would say, yep, you can. You can experience the full blessing of Abraham and be a child of God without keeping the Torah. So then why do I need it?
Right.
I obviously don't need it to be an obedient child and experience the blessing. Paul just argued that. Right? So what do you mean by be saved? Be part of the people of God, experience the blessing of Abraham? What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
What do you mean by, be obedient to God? Well, Paul would never say that. I mean, just read later in Galatians. You keep reading. I mean, Paul argues, he says this, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm there and don't submit again to a yoke of slavery. And in context, he's talking about the Old Testament law. He's just argued that the Sinai covenant's day is done. That she's part. He's actually said something that would have been really offensive to the Jews, even the Jewish Christians. He said that the Sinai covenant is sort of aligned with the flesh in the end of chapter 4, and then he ends that with, it was for freedom that Christ set us free, so don't submit again to the yoke of slavery. In other words, the Mosaic Covenant, the Torah, tends towards slavery. So you better be aware of that. And
Yeah.
So and then he goes on.
Well, that's the pedagogue thing again, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's
you're
under that person's authority.
Yeah.
Do what they say.
Yeah.
Until you're free from it.
Until you're free from that. And so, he says this: I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he's obligated to keep the whole Torah.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that, you're severed from Messiah. You who would be justified by the law. In Paul's mind, it all goes together. It's a package deal.
Yeah.
So if you think, I have to do this in order to be faithful to God, Paul's saying, then what you're doing is you're submitting yourself back. You've tried to move back time. And you're saying, I'm going to live in the Torah box, not the Messiah box. For Paul, it all goes together. So,
and
now, you see with the Apostle Paul, Acts 21, he'll offer some sacrifices.
Yeah.
What? But he doesn't do it to be justified. He doesn't do it as,
it's just like the instructions they give in Acts 15. It's to keep peace with their Jewish neighbors. Yeah. He's doing the same thing.
Yep.
In
You see with Timothy, who was from one of the Gentile or the Galatian churches, ironically.
Yeah.
And Paul circumcised him. Why? Because there's Jews in those areas, and he wants to have a door for the gospel.
And
so
he was Jewish.
Yeah, part Jewish.
Part Jewish. Yeah. His mother was Jewish. So
yeah.
So it was just to say, well, are you a Jew? And he's like, yes. Well, are you circumcised? Well, yeah.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't create that barrier.
Yeah, unnecessary barrier to the gospel.
Yeah.
And then, as I said before we ever jump into Galatians 3, the key thing I would say is Paul's going to tell you how do you be obedient. You do that by walking by the Spirit. That's how you be obedient. That is the prerequisite command to all of Paul's other commands in the New Testament. Walk by the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the desire of the flesh. So if you walk by the Spirit, you will obey God. Walking by the Spirit will lead you into obedience, and you will obey. You will learn how to obey and have the power to obey all the other commands that Paul gives elsewhere in his letters. So.
And kind of parking on that issue again too, that you said about being justified, and these different ways of that Scripture does talk about being saved, so to speak. I've heard and have seen that justified and being justified and being made righteous, like it's the same word in the Greek. That I don't remember what the word is, but that justification and righteousness are really the same.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're from the same root word.
Yeah, and
the word, just to transliterate, D-I-K would be the transliteration of the root, the stem for both the word for justified or justification and righteousness. So the basic idea of justified is to be declared right, to be put into the right or declared right.
Right.
And in the context of biblical theology, that being declared right by God also puts you into His family, makes you part of His family. So when you're declared right by God, you're part of His family, and that's what's going on in this argument is you're declared right by your faith in Jesus as Messiah. You're part of His family. You experience the full blessing of Abraham. You're Abraham's descendants. So as a Gentile, you can be declared part of Abraham's family by your faith in Messiah.
Yeah.
Nothing else. Faith in Messiah moves you into the family of Abraham, which that's one of the things that got Paul in so much trouble with the Jews of his day, because it just felt like he was, I don't know, almost sort of like downplaying his Jewish heritage, minimizing the significance of being a Jew. And again, Paul knew that. That's why he raised it. What benefit is there to being a Jew? Paul asks that in Romans chapter 3. And he says much in every way. So it's like, just like we would say, what benefit is there to growing up in a Christian family? Much in every way. Yeah. You don't have to grow up in a Christian family in order to know God and walk with Him. But there's still a huge benefit to being raised with the knowledge of God, being raised with the knowledge of the Scriptures, right? For the Jews, there was very much that. But as a Gentile, now you get brought into that.
Right. And
you get to experience it as a Johnny-come-lately to the family.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. So, I appreciate that. That was powerful. I've never really had that dug into so deep. I mean, I've read Galatians, but never really gone.
Hopefully, it was a whirlwind tour, and hopefully it was clear, and at least it helped. And
I think that really helps. So, just for the people watching, if they want to get more of what you are producing, in terms of, I know you're doing courses and things on understanding your Bible, how to pray, live the Christian life, essentially. Where can they find you? I'm definitely gonna link your website or anything you give me in the description, but what would be, where can they go right now if they're watching video?
I appreciate that. I appreciate you dropping the website down in the comments down below. My website is johnwhittaker.net. Mm-hmm. So not .com, not .org. Those domain names were already taken by somebody else, not used, not active. But so I got .net. So johnwhittaker.net. Whittaker with 2 T's, Whittaker. So we'll put that in the comments down below, johnwhittaker.net. Find me on Facebook, Instagram. Mm-hmm. Those are my 2 social media platforms as well. Got a small little YouTube channel, but I'm not investing a whole lot of energy in that right now because I'm doing other stuff. But so I'm creating some online courses where it help people learn the big story of the Bible, help them learn how to study the Bible, provide some Bible study tools, some core beliefs. So got a little podcast called Bible in Life, and you can find that on iTunes or your podcast app, or you like to listen to podcasts. I'm really just trying to teach the text. So on that podcast, all I want to do is just walk through the text of Scripture. There's a lot of good Christian podcasts out there. Mm-hmm. There's not a whole lot that just teach the text. They answer theological questions. They deal with church issues or church leadership issues. But I just want to teach the Bible. And so, hence my podcast name, Bible in Life. I believe that Bible teaching ought to be blue jeans theology for everyday life. So I'm just trying to teach the text. I'm actually walking through the Sermon on the Mount right now in my podcast.
That's a big one in this world.
So I'm walking through the Sermon on the Mount and just trying to help us understand. I look at the Sermon on the Mount as as a disciple of Jesus, here's Jesus, greatest hits. It's like Jesus, some of his most important teaching. If you want to follow Jesus, to be a disciple means Jesus is your rabbi. It means he's teaching you how to do life. And so why not start with his greatest hits in the Sermon on the Mount? So I'm walking through the Sermon on the Mount. So Bible in Life, you can check it out there and all that. So
cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate you coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
It's fun.
All right. Thanks for watching, and like and subscribe and share. And we will see you in the next video.